It's a great privilege for us at the Animal Law Center to have Professor Kristen A.Stilt from Harvard Law School to visit Nalsar and to deliver a lecture on animal welfare and religion. You might be aware of the center activities that are going on around you. There are so many research projects that we are working on, and of course there are two RAs who are working on different research projects. We're starting a clinic, which coincidentally is also a really good time to start a clinic, because the Harvard Law School is also starting a clinic in the current academic year. And just to introduce Professor Kristen A.Stilt to you, who will be speaking in a while. Professor Kristen A.Stilt is a professor of law and faculty director of the Animal Law and Policy program at Harvard Law School, and the director of program on law and society in Muslim world. Prior to coming to HLS, Professor A.Stilt was Harrow Professor in International Law at Northwestern Law School and Professor of History at Northwestern University. Professor A.Stilt's research focuses on Islamic law and society in both historical and contemporary context. She writes in the area of animal law and the intersection of animal law and religion and culture in particular. Professor A.Stilt received a JD from the University of Texas School of Law, where she was the associate editor of Texas Law Review and co-editor-in-chief of Texas Journal of Women in the Law. She holds a PhD in History and Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. We at the center, and I'm sure all the students at Nalsar, are really excited to host Professor A.Stilt at Nalsar, and we hope that this is a starting point of a good relationship with Harvard Law School, starting from the Animal Law Center, and then moving on to other centers and other collaborations too. So over to you, Professor A.Stilt. The podium is yours.
Thank you so much, Vivek and Jaya and everyone who played such an important role in inviting me here and facilitating my research time in Delhi and Hyderabad. And I'll say a little more about my research towards the end of the presentation, and just really thrilled to be here and to learn about all you're doing. And I can't believe you're doing so much in such a short amount of time. It's not, the mic's not working. Would you like me to use the other one? Or can this one just be turned on? You prefer that one? That's great. All right, is that better? Is that better? Okay, just to thank you, Vivek, for the introduction, and Jaya and everyone here who made this visit possible, as well as a special thanks to Jaya and his team at HSI, who helped coordinate many aspects of my research trip to Delhi on a Halal project, which I'll say a little bit more about towards the end of the presentation. So I plan to speak for about 30 minutes and welcome your questions for the remainder of the time. And Vivek will wave at me when I have about 10 minutes left. Okay. All right, so I put some of the titles here just to give you a sense that I'm a faculty member, but also the faculty director of something called the Harvard Animal Law and Policy program. I'll say more about. Vivek was also right to say I also direct another program on law and society in the Muslim world. And I'm also serving as one of the 2 deputy deans. That's more of a caution. Don't take so many administrative positions all at once when someone asks you, but serving as deputy dean has given me great insight into how the law school works. And as we build our animal law program, I find that knowing how things work is extremely beneficial to growing a program within the law school. So I do want to say a little bit about the program itself before I turn to my own research, since I understand there's some interest in the room about this topic. So I came to Harvard in 2014 as a faculty member and started the program, but it turns out animal law at Harvard is a lot older than I am. In fact, in 1950, we had a student named George Thorndike Angel. And this is a famous quote from him. I am sometimes asked, why do you spend so much of your time and money talking about kindness to animals when there is so much cruelty to men? I answer, George Thorndike Angel said, I am working at the roots. And this is an extremely interesting line of thought in animal law. It's not the only line of thought, but one line of thought says that cruelty towards animals is a essential issue to be tackled, because cruelty towards smaller creatures, innocent creatures, helpless creatures, can often harden one to violence, to dealing with problems in a brute way, and it can turn into conflicts within society. So this has a modern application in something called the link theory between human and animal violence. It's somewhat controversial, but the point is, you see how someone back in 1850, a Harvard Law student, saying, there's many problems with humans in the world, but I think you can trace some of it back to the way animals are treated. So I think that's extremely important. If you ever come to Boston, you'll see a statue of George Thorndike Angel memorialized in the city. He was a very important member of society. So I want to say a little more about animal law at Harvard and at American law schools. So the number of U.S. Schools offering animal law courses has increased dramatically in a very short time. Are you getting this feedback, or is this okay for you? It's all right? Sound is okay? 9 institutions in the year 2000 offered animal law, and today 167 schools offer it. It's almost every law school in the U.S. has an animal law course. And I put this picture here to see if anyone happens to recognize the gentleman on the left. I'd be shocked if you know who he is on the left.
Joe Biden.
That's interesting. It does look like him. It's not. I gave it away in the earlier conversation. Has anyone seen the game show called The Price is Right? It's probably best you have it. It's not one of our finest cultural products. But there's a very famous host for many years named Bob Barker. And when he retired from game show hosting, he spread his money around to several top law schools, thinking that by teaching animal law, it would help prompt and develop the field of animal law across the country. He was probably right, because law schools tend to be very, what's the right word, status conscious. And so if they see Harvard and Yale and Stanford teaching animal law, they say, oh, we better teach it too. And so in many ways, there's been this spreading effect, such that today we have 167 law schools teaching it. This picture is when he gave money to Harvard back before the year 2000, and next to him is someone named Chris Green, who is now, after his own career, the executive director of the animal law program. So I'll say more about that in just a minute. So what are we doing at the program? What's the goal? There's really 3 goals, and that is our logo. I love it. Compassion, comitas with the lamb. We're trying to expand educational opportunities for students. We're trying to increase the quality and quantity of academic research, and we're informing and educating the broader communities. And we can talk more about any of those. But for now, I want to say a little bit about who we are. We are a huge growing program, and the best way to indicate that is by showing you who we are. So, did that come up? Yep. Did this come up on the screen? The program website? You can see it? Interesting. All right, well, I can just tell you about it. No, see, it should have come to a, no, it's not coming up. That's okay. I'll just tell you by way of saying that there's a faculty director, myself, Chris, the executive director, a program administrator. But excitingly, this year we have we've started a law school clinic, just as you have, and we've hired 2 individuals to run that clinic. I think the link is just not popping up for some reason. And we also have a wide cast of fellows doing really interesting work on farmed animals in particular, as well as visiting researchers from the Netherlands, from Switzerland, working on questions on the environment, on animal rights. So at this point, we're a group of almost 15 people. So we're a very, very large program. Okay, so that slide didn't work so well, but we will keep going. All right, so what are we interested in? What's the program looking at? Well, I want to highlight some issues related to climate change and farmed animals that I think are extremely important to us. And so many of you might have recalled this very important 2006 report by the Food and Agriculture Organization showing the very substantial contribution of animal agriculture to climate change and air pollution, to land, soil, and water degradation, and to the reduction of biodiversity. And that image is not art. It is a feedlot for cattle, which we grow in the United States for food. And that green and yellow is a manure pit. So animals who are produced for agriculture have tremendous environmental damage that is done. And we take that very seriously. And we are quite concerned with the role of climate change and the role of animal agriculture in it. And so much so that we were part of hosting Mary Robinson. Does everyone know who Mary Robinson is? President of Ireland, former president who is now the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And if you can imagine what is a UN High Commissioner of Human Rights worried about in the world, there's a lot of human rights violations, but look what she's talking about. We need, each of us, to think about our carbon footprint. Eat less meat or no meat at all. Let's commit to the Paris Agreement. Let's commit to leave no one behind. She's, of course, talking about the Paris Agreement on climate change. I'm embarrassed to say our country is not following through on, and we hope that will change when we get him out of office, but this is not a political speech. But my point is to say, these are issues that we're extremely concerned about in the animal program that include the animals themselves, their sentience, their own status, but also take into account that animal agriculture is linked to many other wrongs in the world. And Mary Robinson, when she came, spoke quite a lot about climate refugees, that is, people who are no longer to engage in agriculture due to the changing climate in the areas in which they live. We think in the US we're immune to that, perhaps that's why Americans don't take climate change very seriously, but in many other parts of the world, climate change has much more dramatic impact. But I just, again, want to highlight the relationship between animal agriculture and climate change, and to say that's something that we will be working on in our clinic. All right, so with that background in mind, I do want to turn to some of my own research, and I put that under the loose heading of animals and religion. Now, you may think that's just about looking at old texts, looking to find animals in the texts of the Quran or the Torah or the Bible. It sounds archaic. Well, it's not at all. Animals and religion, perhaps people living in India know more than anyone else, is a very important and hot topic, an extremely significant topic in the contemporary world. So let me give you a few examples of the kind of scholarship I've been working on in this field, and then I'll end with the focus on my Halal project and talk to you about your questions. So a few years back, a colleague and I, who's now at a Canadian university, worked on an entry for the Max Planck Encyclopedia of Comparative Constitutional Law. Does everyone here have a sense of what comparative constitutional law is? Is that a course that's offered in the school? Excellent. All right. So we were asked, is there anything to say about animal protection in comparative constitutional law? And we thought, that's an interesting question. No one's really talked about that. There's substantial research on environmental protection in comparative constitutional law. Most constitutions protect the environment, but we wanted to see any constitutions out there protecting animals. Well, we came up with 9. Of course, yours is one of them. Of course, ours is not. But what we found by digging into these is that the role of religion is actually quite profound. Of course, in India, you know that your animal protection clauses have quite a bit to do with religion, but Germany does too, not in the way you might think. The German provision protecting animals came in after animal protection advocates kept losing cases because they were coming up against things like the right to work or the right to conduct scientific experiments. And finally, it was a showdown with the halal butcher that led Germany to say, we keep losing, the animals keep losing, they need their own right in the Constitution, so now it's an animal right going up against a human right, and they were able to adopt a provision in the Constitution. The European Union, of course, is also enmeshed in questions about ritual slaughter. But the Egyptian constitution is also quite interesting. And separate from this Max Planck article, which I can provide a copy to anyone, I wrote an article for a journal called Law and Social Inquiry called Constitutional Innovation in Animal Protection in Egypt. So Egypt's constitutional provision is a state obligation to provide kindness to animals. And it was adopted in Article 45 as part of the country's second constitution following the 2011 revolution that ousted President Hosni Mubarak. So you might wonder, how in the world did a state obligation to protect animals get into the Egyptian constitution? Well, it's a fascinating story of advocates going directly to the drafters seeking for this provision, and they relied on many kinds of arguments. But one argument they relied upon were Islamic arguments, pointing to all the ways in which the Islamic tradition supports animal welfare, and Egypt being a Muslim country, they argued, should have this kind of provision in its constitution. So another example in which religion and animals have gone together to support a constitutional provision. So let me talk then, transition from that to what is it in the Islamic tradition that is positive to animal welfare. So in Islamic law, there's 2 sources of authority: the Quran, believed to be the word of God, and the sayings of the Prophet, which are called the Prophetic Hadith. So let me just give you a couple examples from the Prophetic Hadith. Okay? Here's one of them. When you must kill a living thing, do it in the best manner. And when you slaughter an animal, you should use the best method and sharpen your knife so as to cause the animal as little pain as possible. So I think it's fair to say that this is very much an animal-friendly provision. This is not really about the human or about the community. It's about protecting the animal. And that comes straight from the Islamic sources. And here's another one. A butcher approached a sheep in order to slaughter her, and the sheep escaped and ran to the Prophet, with the butcher running behind. The butcher began to drag her by the leg, and the Prophet told him to herd her gently. So again, this seems very much oriented towards the fear of the animal at the time of slaughter and trying to protect the animal. So these are the kinds of hadith that the Egyptian activists used in an effort to get the Constitution to include attention to animals. All right, so these kinds of texts, the Prophetic Hadith, are part of what led me to my current research project, the one that brought me to India, which is a look at the halal industry. And many of you probably already know, halal is the form of meat consumption as well as product endorsement for Muslims, it's the counterpart to kosher. And my project is to look about debates within the halal industry about animal welfare and to see what's going on and what are the range of considerations that are paid to animals. Okay, everybody with me? Anybody have any burning questions they want to ask before we talk about this research project? Okay, so as you all know, how does a consumer today know that something is halal? Well, back in the old days, halal just was, right? If you lived in medieval Egypt or the Ottoman Empire, nobody was walking around stamping food. It was just, we have a Muslim leader, food is produced in the halal way. Not so today. Today, consumers rely on certification. And this, one of my favorite ones from the Australian context. All right, so what are certifiers looking for when they certify something as halal? It's actually quite simple. They're looking that a sharp instrument is used to cut the jugular veins, carotid arteries, esophagus, and trachea of the animal, generally in a single cut. The animal must die from blood loss due to that cut, which means, of course, the animal was alive at the time of slaughter. And the slaughterer should be a Muslim, or maybe you're a Christian or a Jew. And the slaughterer invokes the name of God at the moment of slaughter. So if you talk to a halal certifier, and I've talked to many, that is basically the list that they will give you. These are the essential ingredients of halal. Now wait a minute. Didn't I just read to you these prophetic hadith about how animals should be treated, right? Do it in the best way. Don't drag the animal to slaughter. Be kind. What about all of those injunctions? Where are they? Those are not appearing in this essential list of halal. Well, this I found to be an extremely interesting question. It didn't seem to make sense to me. So I started talking about this to certifiers, to muftis all over the world. And in fact, I got a very uniform response. And here's the response. Well, those injunctions are true. Those are correct. Those are obligatory. And anyone who violates them has committed a sin. Anyone who sharpens the knife in front of the animal, who kills an animal in front of the other, who drags an animal to slaughter. Anyone who does that is committed a wrongful act under Islamic law, a sin, but it doesn't affect the halal status of the meat. That is, the meat is still halal as long as these simple rules are met. And so I would say, well, doesn't that seem to be a problem? Essentially, all of these rules about kindness to animals, that it would be so essential to having a farmed animal industry that is compassionate as possible, that is most protective of the animal. There's only really one or two people who are responsible for carrying those out, and those are the individuals who are actually handling the animals at the time of slaughter. If they're cruel, if they drag the animal, if they violate these injunctions, it doesn't render the meat halal, not halal, and the consumer then purchases the meat thinking that everything is just fine. So the system lodges all the blame and responsibility on that individual perpetrator and not on anyone else. That is actually, I realize, very similar to the American system. So in the American system, we have laws against cruelty that would apply at the time of slaughter or in the slaughterhouse. And we often have undercover investigations that may show a worker being very cruel to an animal, dragging them to slaughter, prodding them excessively. And anytime these investigations come to public light, come to the media, the answer by the management is always the same. That's not our policy. We didn't know that was going on. That was done by one bad actor. Let's fire that guy. If you want to send that guy to prison for violating the criminal law, that's fine. If you want to give him a fine and make him pay a penalty, that's fine. But it's not our responsibility. We, the company, didn't do anything wrong. So it's the exact same situation with the halal rules. The responsibility is very, very limited, and it certainly doesn't hold the consumer responsible for consuming meat that could have been produced in a cruel fashion. So I view this as somewhat of a problem, not just in the Islamic context, but in any context in which essentially the production process washes the consumer free of all blame. In fact, hides the truth from the consumer, in which their animals may not have been produced in a very kind way. And this, for example, is an article that appeared in the certification magazine by a halal certifier in America, an Islamic perspective on animal welfare. And it goes on to tell consumers about all these injunctions that I've already spoke to you about, saying animals should be treated kindly, et cetera, but it provides no means for the consumer to ever know what goes on behind closed doors. In the era of the modern slaughterhouse, as you probably know, you don't get to see what happens to the animals, not on the farm, not on the transportation system. So even the certifiers themselves are perpetuating this kind of problem. All right, so let me just finish with the question. The question is, that I'm asking in my project, can the halal process, the certification process, expand to make these injunctions of kindness to animals an essential part of halal certification? Can it make knowledge of the animal's treatment transparent to the consumer? And relatedly, is that something that we can do beyond the halal context? How can the consumers be better educated and thus put pressure on producers to do a better job and to be as most humane as possible in dealing with farmed animals? And so I call that responsibility in religion and beyond. How can all these positive injunctions be made meaningful in the era of the modern factory farm and the consumer who purchases a product knowing nothing about its origins in terms of how it was treated? Okay, so I think I'll stop there and take questions. Okay, I thought that was a wave, meaning now it's time to stop. Okay, all right. Well, I think that maybe why don't we take some questions and we'll see where it goes from there. Okay.
So the house is open for questions now. Would ask questions one by one. Yes.
On anything or I said or on nothing I said. I'm open to any questions.
Good afternoon, Pastor. Just come up, there's a mic.
Yeah, please introduce yourself first and then.
Good afternoon. I'm Aditya, and I have a question on what are your views and comments on the Indian context on the ban of slaughter of cows and resulting in unproductive or surplus cattle production. And I have two questions. Can I ask two questions?
Yeah.
And the second question is, what would be the simple, inexpensive changes that you have seen through your research in Delhi or your experience that could be applied to improve the animal welfare standards, in particular male cows?
So those are really difficult questions to ask someone, right, who is coming from outside your culture. I think that, so I'll answer it in a few stages, right? So first of all, I'll say that the perception from the outside, so when, for example, doing this research on comparative constitutional law, is that the Indian Constitution really stands out as protecting animals in a way that goes beyond what any other constitution does, right? It's extremely, extremely protective, right? And then the reality, you start to think about the reality, and then what does it mean for cows to live their entire lives even after they are no longer producing milk? And so I started researching this question of how would it be possible, is it possible to sustain cows for the rest of their lives, even after they not producing milk, and to leave the male calves alive and to take care of them. This is also often in the West called ahimsa milk. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase. And people have done studies on that and looked at the environmental costs, and there's strong costs as well. So I think this is an extremely hard question that's embedded in both animal welfare, but also culture, and also fundamental facts about the dairy industry that we really can't shy away from, which is that the dairy industry produces a lot of extra animals, not only the male calves, but the females after they've ceased to be producing milk. So I think it's extremely complex, but we can't take the dairy production out of the equation. And what was your second question?
What simple and inexpensive changes that can be made to the existing system would result in a higher welfare standard, or at least, for example, in the dairy industry, stunning from higher welfare countries to lower welfare countries, the live trade and export. So just any kind of advice or comments you would have on changes or what could be looked at?
Well, I will say that I'm sorry to say America is not a model for animal welfare. We do, if you look at the world overall, there's no really one country that is perfect. There's no kind of paradise for animals. I think countries do different things, better or worse. But I will say in the farmed animal space, one area that's gotten a lot of traction in recent years, which maybe you've heard about, is looking at confinement questions. So confinement of hens who are laying eggs, confinement of pregnant pigs, and confinement of male calves that are being used for veal. And for some reason, confinement is something that has really resonated with Americans. And I would be curious to hear, I know you're working very hard on battery cage elimination, if confinement is something that resonates with your culture. So we've had good successes in Massachusetts and California, in some states that are trying to phase out these worst forms of confinement for farmed animals. It's not changing fundamental facts about the production of animals for food and for slaughter, but it's attempting to make their lives while they are in that system a little more, maybe I'm getting too close to this. It's trying to make their lives, okay, while in that system a little more humane. And I know in the American case there were a lot of studies about how much would it cost to transfer from battery cages to open, and it's extremely negligible costs that would even kind of even out to zero very, very quickly over time. So that's an area that we've had some success in, but we've had very little success in any slaughterhouse reform, in part because we have a national law that has a strong preemption. And I don't know if preemption is a concept that exists in the Indian legal system, where if the federal government has an exclusive, regulates it, the state can't. So confinement is something that we've been working on. But I'll just throw in on the other end of the spectrum is clean meat technology. That is something that we talk quite a bit about. It would eliminate all of this. Cellular agriculture or clean meat, I think, is another extremely promising development.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, please. Go ahead. Please introduce yourself and just ask crisp and short questions.
Hello. Good afternoon, Professor. I am Apurv Dikshit from third year. So my question is lately in US, a lot of states, not a lot, but states like Illinois and Alaska have started giving animals the legal personhood, as in providing legal personhood to animal other than the statutes. So what my question is, does providing normal provision in the statutes enough, or the lately emerging concept of providing legal personhood to animals, if we talk especially in Indian context where they are allowed to go to court even for their fundamental rights? So there can be a conflict between the animal rights and human rights in that context, and there have been several criticism because of the repercussions of providing them the legal personhood. So I just want you to answer, would it be sufficient to just have certain provisions just for the animal rights, or is it good to provide them legal personhood?
Yeah, so legal personhood is a big intellectual question, I would say, in the U.S., but in terms of kind of on-the-ground changes, we haven't seen that yet. And you know about the Non-Human Rights Project, perhaps, for whom this is their most important question. But the way the legal system works, and I've written about this is that there are laws written for humans and made for humans. And we kind of give animals that which we choose to give them in terms of some legal protections. Others will say, well, animals already have rights because they have the right not to have cruelty committed to them. But what you're talking about is not rights, but actual legal personhood, the ability to sue in their own name or to be released on the grounds of habeas corpus. And I think those are important ambitions and would change the shape of animal law extensively, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of judicial interest in this, or gaining a lot of traction in the judiciary. So there are now efforts, like the NHRP, Non-Human Rights Project, is looking to go towards cities and trying to have resolutions that certain kinds of animals are legal persons. But I don't think we know what that would mean for the long term. It's a very new concept on a practical level. I think intellectually we can understand it, but as a practical level, what would it mean? There's only so far we're going to go when an animal is dependent on a human having a human interest in protecting that animal. There's an article by Richard Epstein that talks about, from his view, he calls the liberatory potential of property. And the argument is that you will take care of your property and animals should be protected that way. And I think we've seen that not to be true in the course of human history. In some cases, yes. Your pet cat or dog would be protected from your neighbor hurting that animal because it's your property. But there are many ways in which that's quite detrimental to an animal to be considered property. So we have to move away from that paradigm, but where we're going to go and how we're going to get there, I think is another question. There's a case pending in Oregon where the litigants are trying to set up a horse being able to sue his owner for negligence, negligent treatment, and that was rejected, and now it's on appeal. So I think we're trying to come at these questions from a lot of different directions, but we haven't gotten there yet. But we're going to need to get somewhere to break out of the system we're in. The last thing I'll say, though, is we're still going to be dependent on humans to essentially stand up for the animals and assert their rights for them. So in some ways we have a fundamentally flawed system, and it's just a question of how can we make it less flawed. I think there's a couple in the back there. Lots. Oh, that's great.
Good afternoon. My name is Prakhar Ganguly. Right. taking cue from whatever you have said, and in terms of what your project is, I don't have any point of difference. I just have a question in terms of the moment you look into religion as a positivist notion, that you're looking into a document and has a commanding authority over you, that is the moment this whatever you're saying is perfectly right. It's there. But if you look into religion in a normative notion, it's a way of life, right? From that, taking cue from that thing, a Muslim can be a good Muslim even if he has pork. A Hindu can be a good Hindu even if he has beef, right? So those things, like pork being banned in Islam, that's a different context altogether. But my point is that if we take into this notion of religion, the normative notion of religion, and taking a step backwards from your research, will it not be a way of life for a heinous animal like a lion to attack me when I'm standing in front of it? Right, one. And two, which kind of violence is kind of prohibited? Are you looking into violence that has some mercantile notions to it?
That
right?
has some what?
Market-oriented notions to it. Right? So if a violence, the end result of a violence to a particular animal has notions of profit, loss, selling the meat to the market, is something is that prohibited, or as an entirety you want cruelty against animals to be prohibited? And all this is premised on the fact that I'm looking into religion as a way of life, not a positivist set of documents which says what you have to do and what you can't do.
So I can't really comment on the Hindu religion. It's out of my set of expertise.
Right. Let's just talk about Islam only then.
Sorry?
Let's talk about Islam. I mean.
Yeah. So in terms of Islamic tradition, of course, it's a way of life. There are Muslims who have varying degrees of fidelity to the texts, and I'm in no way saying someone is a Muslim or not. I'm not here to engage in that kind of, I think, very counterproductive and very dangerous conversation of, if you break this, you've somehow left the faith. What I'm saying is that we have today an extremely powerful halal certification system. This is a multi-billion, multi-trillion dollar industry at this point, and it's built up around some basic ideas in which the animal welfare angle has largely been left out. And so I think it is fair to call this industry to task and to say, you have built up this set of rules that are fairly straightforward, and you look to achieve them with some rigidity, some sort of formularity. But what about all these other injunctions? Where did they go? And don't you bear some responsibility for bringing them back into the fold? Because right now, the average Muslim consumer is distanced from the animals. Yes, there are some people in rural areas, but urban areas, you buy your meat from a butcher or a store, you don't know if that animal was, had a terrible transportation on the way to the slaughterhouse, or there was terrible cruelty in the slaughterhouse. And the certifier is by and large not going to let you know. And so Muslim consumers have this information gap, and yet there are these injunctions that somehow the certifiers feel like, well, if it was done wrong at the slaughterhouse, it's not our fault. We didn't do it. And what I'm saying is, we need to kind of crack this problem open and look at it and talk about it and figure out, is there a better way to provide consumers information, which would then, I think, put pressure on the farmed animal industry to do better.
So we're looking into animal cruelty and violence only where there are notions of market and not in general?
Oh no, I just think the market makes it worse.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the commodification of an animal product right there is you have to be concerned. Whenever someone's making money off of an animal, I think right there you have a heightened sense of concern. But obviously, cruelty can take place outside of any market context. And
so, like, if market is the last, if last. If we are looking to regulate the market, then
Sorry, if I didn't hear you.
so if you're looking to regulate the market in terms of the activities they undertake while dealing with animal meat, right? So why do we have to bring in religion to it? Why can't we have market regulations exclusive to that domain?
I mean, that train has left the station a long time ago, right? We already have a massive halal certification industry, and trying to undo that, I'm not sure how you would do that. We have it; it's already done. I think there are many Muslims I know who would say, look, our religion says the food of Christians and Jews is licit to you, and they don't get caught up in looking for the halal symbol. But many, many, many do. And that halal symbol has taken on great significance. And I think we need to look behind that symbol and find out what's really going on.
Okay, so we'll have just 2 more questions and then we'll try to wind up the session. Benjamin, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Benjamin. So, in looking at animal welfare with religion or religious practice or traditions or culture as either the basis or as a supplement to further the same, is it not possible as a result of varied interpretations that there would be either rejection or resistance of the same, or even of reference to the same to further cause against animal welfare? For example, in a context of eating meat, whether it's in the Bible or whether it's in the Quran or in the Gita or any other religious text, or in someone's culture, or something that allows for, say, slaughter, or rather mandates slaughter as a result of some occasion. So, I mean, in that aspect, how helpful is it to look at religion as, because it might be somewhat of an obstacle in that context?
This is the ultimate question, and I'm really glad someone asked this before the hour was over. So and it relates back to the question that was just asked, and it's a question that not only animal advocates face, women's rights organizations face this too, human rights organizations face this also. Human rights organizations in the Muslim world, by and large, I know Egypt the best, will not enter into religious arguments. You know why? They don't want to cede the space. They don't want to accept that this is a valid discourse. They see human rights as international human rights. They come from a different source, and once you give an Islamic argument, you better be prepared to take one in advance, and if in return. And you may not like the one that you get in return, and you may not know what to do with it. You may not know what to counter it. Women's rights organizations accept that the sphere has been set for them. They may push against it, they may want secular laws, but they also have to fight, so to speak, in the sphere they have, which is that family law is religious law. Right? Family law is Islamic law, even in a country as secularized, if that's the right word, as Tunisia, for example. And so animal protection advocates, I think, have a choice. They can go one of these different ways. They can say, we're not talking about religion because there's good texts and there's bad texts for us. We're not going to talk about it. The problem is they don't have the luxury of deciding. So these advocates in Egypt I work with, who asked me to write basically a treatise on Islamic law and animal welfare, they needed it because they were getting sources cited to them that were very anti-dog. We could talk about the dog for a long time. We can't right now. And they wanted help refuting claims that the dog is dirty and therefore is permissible to be killed. And so I work with them to provide counter arguments. So for them, saying, sorry, we're not engaging in these arguments, we only give secular answers, is not going to win the conversation that they're engaged in. They have to meet religious arguments with religious arguments, right? And I think the same to the halal industry, as you said. The halal industry operates by saying we are ensuring that this food or beverage or clothing or tourism, it goes on, meets religious tenets and standards. And so to say, we don't accept this industry because we think you have beliefs that are anti or not best for animal welfare, we would just be walking away from an opportunity. So I think the stage has been set, so to speak, to engage in this. One could still say, hypothetically, someone could say, I'm a secular person. I'm going to eat what I eat. I don't care if it's halal or not. It doesn't concern me. But we're living in a world in which these things matter, and halal as a share of the market is getting bigger and bigger. And as I mentioned, it's tourism, it's hotels, they serve alcohol or it's not. So I feel like we have to engage with it. I feel that way. I feel that that's my skill set. But other people may take a different view and say, I just want to use secular arguments. I don't want to talk about religion at all. And I respect that view too. And I think there's a certain place for that. There's a place for all these arguments. But you sort of take what you're dealt, and I look around the world and I see a place to engage in this important topic.
Hello ma'am, Abhishek here. Ma'am, I understood the whole thing regarding the responsibility of religion and regarding animal rights in case of a food chain structure.
Yes.
But ma'am, I have a different aspect to the responsibility of religion in case of animal rights. There was a situation in Nepal, a whole ritual was there in Gadimai festival, in which like thousands and numerous amount of animals were killed or sacrificed in the name of religion. I am not pointing on any particular religion, but I want to ask to get your opinion on what should be the responsibility of religion in case of sacrificing of animals in its name.
Yeah.
So this perspective.
Yeah. So I think this is follows from what I just said. How you've identified an issue. You see it as an animal welfare problem. How do you want to engage? So you could choose many levels. You could say, I can't talk about the religious angle, and I'm making this up because I know something, but not a lot about that festival. You could say this is environmentally dangerous, or it has human health impacts, or the animals are transported from a long distance. I mean, again, I'm making up facts. You could engage with this on many different levels, or if you are so have the talent, you could try to engage with the religious reasons for it. And in the Islamic tradition, people will say, well, I'll take slavery for example. Very, very volatile topic. Slavery is not praised in the text, but it's permitted. But every country has banned it, and they say it's not prohibited, but it doesn't have a place today. It doesn't work today. It's not right today. Right? We have a different view of human rights, and so all these Muslim majority countries have banned slavery, and so you could say, if it was appropriate, this festival has these external negativities. Maybe it doesn't have a place in today's society. I mean, these are interpretive questions that are not unique to your example or the examples of others. They're questions about how to engage in religion, and do you do it internally or externally? And internally, how much room is there to offer different views, and to offer views that are more in line with science or other things that are known about facts in the world today.
Positive time, we will not be able to take any more questions because Professor Kristen A.Stilt has a meeting at 2 o'clock and she has to rush.
Oh, I'll take questions forever, but I do have to go. I think I have to go. So
if you can share your contact details with
Sure. Sure.
You can get in touch with her and ask any number of questions that you want. And I think thank you so much.
Maybe someone can coordinate those questions.
Yeah, sure. So ALC will coordinate all those questions for you.
So the questions can probably come to the RAs, and they're probably going to be some repetitive questions, so she can kind of I'm very loud. So the questions could probably come to the RAs, and the RAs can kind of look into questions, maybe make them into common theme, and then impose any time, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor, for taking the time. to speak to our student body on this extremely controversial yet very interesting topic of religion and animal welfare. I felt that your remarks on halal, not just as a religious practice, but also as an industry, and the dairy industry is very timely, especially in a time when more than 40% of the meat that we produce in India is coming from organized, formal, large industries, right? So these large industries, of course, have immense power to lobby and change laws and policies in their favor, and this is exactly the experience that the center had on banning battery cages. The amount of efforts required to challenge such lobbies and the state, which often subsidizes animal industry, is tremendous, and the only way I see that happening is through alliances and collaborations with people and organizations who care about social justice, and I'm sure Harvard Law School is one of those universities which care about social justice. In the initial part of your lecture, you mentioned that yours is a large organization now. We are a really small one, and I'm sure there is a lot to learn from your experience from the animal law program that you have running in Harvard Law Center. And the comment with which you started by Mary Robinson, let's commit to leave no one beyond. I think as lawyers we have a duty to ensure that in this definition of no one, animals are also included and they are also counted as legal persons, and we have started that journey now at the center through the clinic. We would love to hear from you how your clinic runs and how what kind of work you are doing there, and we would love to hear from you in the future too. Thank you for speaking to the students.